Hi, I'm Paul Antonio. In this introduction to the geometry of calligraphy, I am going to focus on Copperplate script. So I decided to focus on the way in which geometry impacts our understanding of calligraphy. Now, I look at this with all the scripts I teach, but this particular set of videos will focus on Copperplate script. And we're going to look at how to use some of the manuscript nibs, namely the manuscript G nib and the Leonardt EF principle, which is also called the EFP. I tend to refer to it as the principle because that's how I started off with it. I'm going to take you through a little handout, and this handout, I've pulled excerpts from my larger Copperplate script course, as well as the PA Scribe geometric Copperplate worksheets. Now, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take you through a series of very specific steps. We'll start off with straight lines, vertical lines, and we'll very quickly move from vertical lines to boxes, and then we'll take those boxes and we'll slant them to 55 degrees, which is the axis of the script. And I will take you through a series of trainings which should help you to understand the scale and the curvature of the ellipses that we use in Copperplate script. Now, I have found that when I teach my students, that helping them to systematically move from something that is more angular to something that is more of an elliptical curve is not really a matter of going from A to B. There are 4 or 5 steps in between where you're slowly rounding off the corners. And the great thing about this is it helps you to force yourself to slow down. So as you're accustomed to writing an angle, every time you hit that vertex, you're just going to slow down. And slowly you keep that slowing down. So when you come to the writing of the letter, you're not just doing this, you're really taking your time. So training you to move from an angular shape to a more rounded shape and retaining the slower pace of the writing is really a big part of the key to how the script works. And of course, another aspect to this, which I use a lot in my work, in fact, I don't use it a lot, it underpins all of the work I teach, is how our breath affects the way in which we write. So when we breathe slowly and rhythmically, that slow rhythmic breathing as we inhale on the upstroke and exhale on the downstroke, that helps the letter to form more beautifully, more easily, and more accurately. And that's really going to underpin this geometry. So a big part of how we're going to practice this is not just about the writing, it's also about how the writing can connect you to a much deeper, more meditative aspect to your practice of the craft of calligraphy. Now, let's look through this crazy handout that I put together for you. So the handout starts off simply enough. It says, an introduction to the geometry of calligraphy, Copperplate script by Paul Antonio, monoline, nib, and ink. So we're going to be using monoline, nibs, and ink. We'll be using my ink. We'll be using my black ink, which is a pointed nib ink, and it's specially formulated for pointed nibs. There is a broad edge ink as well, and there is a sepia, which works really well in pointed nibs as well. But we'll focus on the pointed nib ink and the sepia because the edged ink is really for broad edge nibs. So we're going to start off with some squares, circles, and straight lines, and I will show you why once we start that. Next, we will move on to some elliptical shapes at 55 degrees in a particular square. Now, this is my grid. So this is a grid that I developed to specifically work with the way I write Copperplate script. And then we will look at going from from parallelograms to slightly more rounded shapes. We'll also look at the same thing with the line of universal beauty, and then into this shape, which generates our letters A, M, V, and W. And then we will look at how to actually write the letter A from those angular shapes into chamfered shapes. So I call these an angular confinement pattern. They belong to part of my fourfold symmetry, which I use to teach Copperplate script. And of course, we'll do the letter B, and then I'll take you through the minuscules on this grid, which is one of the grids that I've been using for the last sort of 30 years. This grid is a 6mm grid with 55-degree lines at 30mm between, and I found this a really excellent grid for practicing Copperplate script on. So you get this handout in, you will get a link, and you can download it. And in that zipped folder, you will find the A4 and the US letter size versions. So once you unzip the file, choose which one you need, depending on where in the world you are and what kind of paper you have access to, and then print it off and use it as guide sheets underneath a sheet of paper, like layout paper or marker pad paper. Make sure the paper you're going to work with can handle ink, because we will be doing this in monoline shape as well as in nib and ink. So please double check that the nibs and the inks and the papers that you have decided to use will work together, because not all inks will work with all nibs on all papers. Before you start writing, the first thing I need to show you is how to prepare these nibs. Now, there are lots of ways to prepare nibs. I will always tell you, under no circumstance, stick your nib into potato, because if you put the nib incorrectly into the potato, you could damage the tines of the nib. Now, some of the stiffer nibs, they are happy to deal with things like potatoes or brushing them with toothbrushes and that sort of thing. But the gentler and thinner nibs their tines can be bent very easily. And if the tines are bent whilst you're trying to clean it using a potato or a toothbrush or something abrasive, you've ruined the nib. There is no way to fix it. And the amount of time and effort it will take to fix it, you might as well use a new nib. So stay away from the potatoes, because they can damage the tools. There is also a very specific way to use a flame. Now, lots of people will put the nib into the flame and wait until they see it glowing hot, because when they put the nib into the ink, they want to hear. That is the worst thing to do with your nibs, because if you do that to a nib, you've completely destroyed the temper in the nib. Now, there is a way to do it with a flame, and I will demonstrate it to you, but what you have to be careful of is you cannot, under any circumstance, wait until the nib is glowing hot, because you've completely destroyed the temper in the metal, and that makes your nib softer, and the nib will wear away more quickly. So what you do is you glide it through the flame. So I'm going to show you a couple of these tips. Now, one of the other things I do with nibs, and as I'm using the G nib, is I build a key pattern to the nib. So what I do here is I increase the surface area on the underside of the nib so that it has more texture, and that texture allows the ink to hold onto the nib more carefully. Let's start with the flame. So I'm using a principle, and I have it in one of my favorite colors, which is this lovely turquoise. What I'm going to do is I'm going to light the flame with my left hand, and I am going to run it back and forth through the flame like so. Now, as you can see, I'm not resting it in the flame, and that is more than enough. Now, I can smell that the nib is a little odd, and that's the coating burning off. So I know that this now has no coating on it. Now I'm going to do it with the G nib, but I'm going to be very, very careful because the metal is very different. Now, the metal here is not coated in the same way. And you can see that it's changed color a little bit. There we go. You can see it's changed color a little bit. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to add a pattern under this. I'm going to braid it. I'm going to take a piece of 180p sandpaper. I'm just going to curve it, and I'm going to curve it around the pen staff. And then I'm going to put it underneath. So what I'm not doing is this. I'm not pressing down. Do you see how the tines have opened up there? I want to keep the tines closed. I'm going to tighten this. And I'm just going to rub it back and forth. Now you can see the tines are opening a little bit, and I don't really want them to open more than that. So what that's done is it's abraded the underside, and you could just see a little bit of roughness, just sort of there where the inside of the shoulders are quite reflective. This is now a little bit more stippled. And so that's going to hold the ink better. Now, as this has settled down, you can see that this has also changed color. So the good thing about it changing color is I've not sat it in the ink in the flame. It's changed color very, very slowly, very gradually. And it only really changed color once I left it away from the heat. The other thing I didn't do was I didn't drop it into the ink and have it go. Now, as satisfying as it sounds, that absolutely ruins the nib, and it softens the material, the metal, and it makes sure that the metal then becomes very soft and pliable, and it wears away even quicker. So you know that question you always ask people, oh, how long does a nib last? Well, it won't last very long if you do that. So be really, really careful with your nib. Before we get started with the practice, let's look at some of the materials we're going to use for this first part of the process. So I'm going to run through everything in this handout with a pencil first, and then I'm going to run through it again with a monoline tool. And then we'll come back to using the nibs. So it's a real progression. The reason to start you off with a pencil is it's a tool you're accustomed to using. You're comfortable with it. And because you're comfortable with it, it means that you only really need to focus on the exercise. Next, we move to a tool that does sort of the same thing that a pencil does, but it's ink. And as you are a little bit more conversant with the exercises, it's just a matter of trying to get those exercises working with that tool. Next, when we move to the nibs, they are a little bit more problematic. And so you have come to terms with the shapes of the exercises. And now all you're struggling with is the use of the nib with the ink on the paper. So this is one of the ways that I find is very useful when I teach lots of scripts. I always start off with a pencil, I move to a monoline tool, and then I move on to the difficult tools once students are comfortable with the shapes that they've sort of conquered earlier on with some of the simpler tools. Now I am starting with a pencil, but there are some things that I have to show you first. And the principal thing I have to show you is this couching pad. So what I've done is I've taken some, obviously a white background with white paper. I've taken some sheets of copy paper, so about 5 sheets, and I've just stapled them together. So this gives me a couching surface to work on. I generally don't work on a couching surface. I like the hardness of my table to press against. But I find that in some instances, it's useful when you're working with individual sheets of paper. So I'm just using some layout paper. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take 2 paper clips, line it up at the top, and align and clip the paper in place with the paper clips. Make sure you use two paper clips. You don't want to use one clip, because if you use one, the sheets will start moving around. Once you have that in place and it's on top of your couching sheet, then you can really sort of get started with the practice. So because it's Copperplate script, my desk is set up for Copperplate script, which means I would be writing here. And because we're starting off with straight lines, you'll find that instead of being in my normal position, I have to move this way because I don't want to move the camera. So let's figure out what we're going to do. We're going to start with some straight lines. You can see the point of the pencil there. I am going to snap it off in the margin and just rub it down till I have a little edge. And I'm going to work on that edge. We're going to start with a series of straight lines. Inhale, wait, wait, exhale, inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale, inhale. Notice I'm not using my fingers. I'm using an arm movement. My wrist isn't engaged. And so this really helps with the practice. And we're going to do different types of lines. So let's zoom in a little bit. So these different types of lines are heavy, medium, and light. You should be able to do pages and pages of these lines. Always do them in groups of 5. I'm only doing them in groups of 3s because of the squares I have here. And next we're going to do them in pressure and release line. So we're going to press, release, and press. Now, this is a breath control movement. So we're going to go inhale, exhale, so I'm not holding my breath here. So it's essentially what I'm doing is I'm going. So there's lots of air, little bit of air, and lots of air. And the breath, you use the breath to punctuate the air. It can then direct you to make different types of these strokes. Now, this is one of the most amazing strokes I can teach you when it comes to learning Copperplate, because it trains you to start the stroke slower, increase velocity a little bit through the stroke, and slow down as you get to the end of the stroke. So by using this punctuation of air, you can get you get 3 very different strokes depending on how you use the air. Next set of exercises is taking you through to writing. So I've left you some extra space here for you to do these exercises. Writing the square. We start, we inhale. It's really important to do this in one go. Don't go 1, 2, 3, 4. Don't do that. You really want to do this as one exercise. Take your time with it. Don't rush it. Inhale. Now, you could also change the structure of this exercise and go find that top movement quite difficult. Now, you can also do this differently and go to where you alternate. Now, this is a really important part of how I teach, and that is to take a square and to plot a circle in it. We have to create these tangential touching points, which are at the cardinal point. So we have north, south, east, and west. The next is to do it where you have the diagonals as well. Now, what we do is we plot the curve. So we go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 and 7 and 8. So that then gives us and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. So eventually we can 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, or 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 and 6. Now, by plotting it with the 45-degree lines as well, that would tell us that this 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 and 7 and 8 helps us to plot the circle in a square. Of course, when you're using the muscular movement exercise, 1, 2, and 3. Notice sometimes you'll find that there's a little bit of lopsidedness here. And that's to do with how the arm works. Don't forget to also do it this way. One of the things to also remember, which is on the sheet, is to date and number your work. Now, I also say to put your name, because if you're sharing this with friends, at least they know who this is from. So I normally date, year, month, day, and number the work so that I know what I'm doing, and I can look back at this later on and say, okay, so on this date I did this exercise. Let's try it now and see how we've improved. And keeping your work in chronological order. Being able to find it in chronological order is really important, because, you know, lots of people keep their work, but they don't date it and they don't number it. And so when they see it, there is no understanding of how they're improving. And it really does help with your confidence levels to look at your work and see how it improves over time. Now, I would suggest you go through the whole handout that I've created with a pencil first, and then come back with it and do it with a monoline tool. I'm going to switch to the monoline tool, otherwise this is going to be a very long course for me. But I want you to go through this systematically, do all of it with a pencil first, and then come back and do it with a monoline tool, and then come back and do it with the nib and ink. So of course, I'm only going to choose one nib, which is going to be the principal. You might decide that it's best that you use the G nib because maybe you can't control the principal that well and you have to work your way up to it. Now, of course, Manuscript make an absolutely amazing range of pointed flexible metal nibs. And you have to work through these systematically to know which is the most rigid and work through from hard to medium to soft in flexibility. Just remember, the size of the nib does not necessarily indicate the size of the writing associated with that nib. So I'm using a Uniball UM153. This is my preferred monoline tool for my practice and for how I build my handouts. So we're going to go on to page 3. And on page 3, we see these exercises. So these are parallelograms, and this is roughly the width of my Copperplate script minuscule letter. So we're going to work through rounding off the edges. So we have, and I start here because I have to inhale. So inhale, go up and over. Come on, there we go. And 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Out and up. And 1 and 2, 3 and 4 and 5. Now my letter O is made from here, so I do this. And I make my reverse comma there. Lots of people do it at the top. I tend not to do that because if you do it at the top, then the ligature comes out from the top and it can be quite problematic. Join another letter from the top of the O. So this exercise trains you to get from here to here. Now the slowing down is really important. Don't rush the exercise. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You should be able to do a whole page of that. And then we're going to slowly round the edges off. And 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And you see how much that slows me down. 1 and 2, 3 and 4, 5 and 6 and 7. So by slowing down, you see I missed this corner a little bit because I was a little too fast. By slowing down, it really helps me to manage the pace at which I'm writing. And you know, one of the problems with calligraphy is a lot of you write way too quickly. And when you're writing fast, there are some intrinsic problems with writing fast. And the main problem is you are not giving the tool the time to do work. So if you come around and you press, the ink can't leave the nib properly and it doesn't flow, and you're writing without actually making a mark. And that can be quite frustrating, and it's all down to the pace at which you're writing. Now, I try not to ever use that word speed, because if I say the speed at which you're writing, you immediately start thinking fast. So I always try to say slow and slower, or even slower, or I use the word pace more than I would use the word speed, because of that association you have with the word speed. So now let's get back to this exercise and be really conscious. I would want you to do a whole line of these. Next, we're going to skip one so that you can see what those were. We're going to round off a little bit more. Remember, inhale, exhale, and inhale. This is a little bit rounder than this is. And so we're slowly rounding off these shapes. So we now want to round off a little bit more. And a little bit more. And now, as we did with those tangential touching points, let's aim for touching the curve at the center and keeping on the axis. Notice how this is off the axis of the 55 and this is on the axis. And so this now starts to give me my letter O. Of course, this gives us so we're going to take page 4 and we're going to go through the same exercise. Now that first exercise on page 3 was to help you understand the minuscule height letter. And the exercises on page 4 really pertain to the majuscule letters. So it's still the same principle about making the straight lines with the sharp vertices and then slowly, gradually rounding those off. Remember, what I didn't do was I didn't come around the curve. I really took my time on the turn and on the other turn. So I was really controlling that turn. Now, when you come to writing the true elliptical shape, you still engendered that turn in the writing. So it helps to train you to write slower. So let's look at this exercise. So I'm going to shift my sheet along. And so we're going to start with the full exercise. Now, you can do it anti-clockwise or you can do it clockwise. I'm going to do it clockwise and I'm starting at the halfway mark. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1 and 2, 3 and 4, 5. Now, 1 and 3, 5, 6, 7 and 8. And let's aim for a little bit rounder. And 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 and 7, 9 and 10. And now we're aiming for the middle. Now I'm doing this, I've done this in 4 goes. I expect you to spend time on each one of these rather than doing them this quickly. And look at where I'm starting. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. And look, I am still at the axis of 55. Now let's go down sheet. And so we are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And 1 and 2, 3 and 4, 5 and 6. And 1 and 2 and 3 and 5 and 6 and 7 and 8. And 1 and 2 and 3, 4. Of course, you should be able to do these both in both directions. And we go down to the smaller size, because all of these sizes are important. And we go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And 1 and 2, 3 and 4 and 5, 6. And 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, 5 and 6 and 7 and 8, 9 and 10. And 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. Again, be conscious of that central axial line. You need to keep the 55 in the center of the shape. And sometimes the shape twists, and be really aware when it twists, because that's not something you want to train yourself to continually do. Page 5 takes us to two very basic exercises, one of which is the backbone of the majuscules, which is the line of universal beauty. Now, the minuscules have their own major line, which is the swelled stroke. And by understanding how the line of universal beauty works, as well as the single parallelogram with shape, which is the basis of the A, M, V, and W, it is not the basis of the N. So don't mix that up, because the N doesn't really belong to those to group 1 of A, M, V, and W. So let's jump into this. So this is what we're working with. And I'm using this monoline tool because I really want you to see what I'm trying to achieve here. So practice, train yourself. 1, 2, 3. 1 and 2 and 3. And 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. 1 and 2, 3 and 4. 1 and 2, 3 and 4. Now, we're going to zoom out a little bit. We're going to so my Copperplate script is divided into sixths. So we're going to make a curve here and a curve here. So we're going to 1 and 2, 3 and 4. 1 and 2, 3 and 4. 1 and 2, 3 and 4. And 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. Some of you might say, well, why have you left all this space? You could quite easily put more in here. The reason the space is there is for you to mark up corrections. So if I was marking this up, I would go angle is incorrect. That's nice and straight. What happened here? And I would make notes in between. Now you can see there's enough space. There's a line space because these notes pertain to this, and these notes pertain to that. So the next exercise is, this starts at the bottom. So we go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, within one stroke, 1 and 2, 3, 4, and 5, and 1 and 2. Oh, I've gone off the stroke there. 1 and 2, 3 and 4, 5, 6, and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5. Because what this does is it generates something called the acute curvilinear triangle. Because it's an acute triangle up here, and it's curvilinear because it's curved. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. It gives us the 8. I will look at this in more detail later on. But this shape is really important to train yourself on how to get to that. Notice one of the biggest problems is most people do this. You see how this looks like it's falling over. You see how this doesn't look like it's falling over. So be conscious of what's happening up here. This, if you look at this, that is not an acute angle, but that is. That's a nice, tight, sharp angle. What I'm also not doing is I'm not going over and back. It's not a wave. It's quite short. That really helps to keep your letters upright. On page 6, we're going to look at the letter A, and of course I talked to you about that acute curvilinear triangle. how that affects the development of the letter. So remember, don't rush the letter. You know, for a lot of people, you're thinking, oh, but why are we going through all these little rounding off of edges? I have found with my students that this really helps you to understand the script, because when you try to go straight to the letter with a nib, you're grappling with the nib, the ink, the paper, and the shape of a new letter. By slowly coming to terms with the shape of the letter, you train yourself to approach it slower and more precisely. And that precision is what is necessary to get Copperplate script to work quite accurately. So with the letter A, as we can see here, so this is my angular confinement pattern for the letter A. So we start inside the turn. We have to make the movement first. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Immediately this shows you that crossbar is not at the halfway mark, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. You see how I had to slow down around that turn, and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, and 1 and 2, 3 and 4, 5 and 6 and 7 and 8, 9, 10, 11, and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 and 6, 7. So it's the same process for the letter B, which is on page 7. Now the B is a great letter to do this practice with, because it really changes your approach to the writing of the shape. So we have, remember, 1, 2, 3, 4. Inhale, exhale, and there's our B. Now, 1 and 2, 3 and 4, 5, 6, and 7 and 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 15, and 16, 17, 18, 19. Now let's increase the roundness. And let's do the monoline shape. Now, let's move to the nib and ink. Now, as I said, I'm using my ink because it's fantastic. It's very clean, it's very sharp, and I understand how it works and why it works the way it works. I've also cobbled together a sheet of pages 3, 4, and 5, 5, 6, and 7, I think as well. Yes, so I want you to systematically go through the sheets, go over them. I'm just going to show you how to get through them. So this is the sheet that I've done. You don't have this in the handout because this is just for me to get through these exercises. So let's get started. So I'm using the principal. I'm going to put another sheet of couching paper under here because the principal is quite cantankerous. So you have to be really careful with how it interacts with the surface, the substrate upon which you're writing. So I'm dipping. Now, There is a technique to dipping as well. What I'm going to do is I'm going to dip, and I'm going to tap. You see a little bit of ink came off. Now, if I dipped and I flicked, did you see how much ink came off when it came up here? I've just flicked off all the ink. I'm not wiping it on the side either. I'm going to dip and just tap, and that leaves enough ink on the page to do the work. So let's get through this. And 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And 1 and 2, 3 and 4, 5 and 6. So this is why working so slowly is really important, because once you start working with a nib, the lines are even finer. And of course, now I'm going to apply some pressure. Inhale, exhale. And so I only put the reverse comma in to show you what I'm doing. Y turns into an O. This we have 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 and 6. And of course, this could, in its anti-clockwise, if we are rounding it off, we would get 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. Now let's go to the narrower shapes, because this is where the letters really come into their own. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 and 6. And 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5. Notice this stroke is not as heavy as that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1 and 2, 3 and 4, 5 and 6, and 1 and 2 and 3. Next, we have the line of universal beauty. 1, 2, 3, and 1 and 2, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 and 6. And that takes us to the A, where we have to make the spiral first. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 and 7 and 8, 9. I've sort of rushed ahead. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, and 3, and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5, 6 and 7 and 8 and 9, and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. And that gives us, and aim for the third, and the third. This third takes you over there. So we have 1 and 1 and 2 and 3, 4 and 5 and 6, 7 and 8 and 9. And so the letter gives us let's look at the B. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 1 and 2 and 3, 4, 5, 6 and 7 and 8, 9, 10 and 11 and 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, and 1 and 2 and 3, 4, 5 and 6 and 7 and 8, 9 and 10 and 11. The tighter the turn, the slower the movement. And inhale to get up to the cap height. Exhale. Inhale. And there is our letter. So the writing of the Majuscules takes time. If you are not writing as slowly as I'm writing, you're obviously not giving the tool the time to do work, which means you're going to slip around on the surface and you're going to have lots of other little issues. Now, I keep going back to my ink because it's fantastic and it only came out in June, so I'm really happy. There are some properties that we included in the ink to help nibs like the principal and some, well, to help all pointed flexible metal nibs. And that is to allow the nib to retard its movement along the surface, and it doesn't slip as easily with many other inks. So when you're working with the nibs, you really need to give the nib time so that the writing fluid, ink acts like a lubricant. So if the fluid doesn't have enough retarding agent in it, the nibs can slip across the surface. So you really have to slow down. You have to put the work in to make sure that the nib isn't slipping because of the ink. Now, lots of people think, oh, I'm not writing well, it's a problem. And you might find that the problem is not you. The problem is the way that the writing fluid is interacting with the nib that you're using on the paper that you're using. Just be conscious of that, be aware of what's happening with the materials that you're using, because they will directly influence how you are going to then produce your final work. So let's see how that geometry helps to hold the script together and really pull it together to help you produce a more rhythmic writing. One of the big problems people have with writing any kind of script is the spacing. The geometry is critical. More than that, the breathing is critical. Because if you allow the breathing the time to do the work, the breath will space the letters for you. So I'm going to write some text. I generally choose to write lorem ipsum because it's a placeholder text that type designers use. It's in Latin. It's an absolute nightmare to write. And it really forces you to focus on the text. So I have my lorem ipsum printed off here. And as I write, I put a sheet over it. So I'm only really looking at the line I'm going to write. I'm also going to use my my PA Scribe Sepia ink, which is this copper. It's a aged sepia. And it's a sort of greeny, yellowish, brownish ink. And it's a color that I really love. It's a color I saw in a manuscript in the year 2000 in Zurich, and it stayed with me. So now I'm going to talk you through as I write this. So I'm going to dip, as I showed you earlier on, dip up to and including the vent hole, which is the reservoir. You see that little cross there. Dip and tap, so any excess ink comes off. Now, I generally work at 1:1 for Copperplate. So my Majuscules are usually 1 X height higher than my minuscules. I'm going to do a large L. Now, let's see how this is going to work with the structure of the script itself. Inhale. So you can see that I'm using the geometry of my grid, so the minuscule grid, which is that grid. I'm using that underlying geometry to house the letters. And you can see that all of the letters are evenly spaced. And even with that spacing, you'll find that I'm using geometry to build, this is on the 55, to build my flourishes. Now, we did this line of universal beauty shape, which was that, and I've only extended it. I'm really using the geometry to help me hold the script together. I'm going to do a Majuscule D. And you can see that geometry is kicking in again. That geometry helps me to plot a spiral if I wanted to go inside of that D and create a spiral. And so let's let's do Dolor again with that spiral. So there was no need to press there because you have weight here, you want a hairline and weight there. I'll use the other R. I'm going to stop there. So the little bit of information that I've shown you about how the geometry works, housing the script, some of those exercises we did early on with the small parallelograms and how to sit the letters inside of the shape. And that's why you have to keep the shape of the letter at the angle of the script, which is 55. If you rotate it in the parallelogram, it's not going to be at 55. Now, my Copperplate script is decidedly different from everybody else because it's based on this rigid geometrical structure. Now, once you learn it, you can learn anybody else's script. It also gives a really good grounding for the learning of earlier scripts on which Copperplate is based, which belong to the family of scripts known as English roundhand. The Principle is a great nib for this, and it will show some really wonderful possibilities. And I'll just finish off by showing you some English roundhand just to get you fired up about some historical scripts from the 18th century. So with English roundhand, where with copperplate you would have with English roundhand, the letters and the script, minuscules would be different. So this is one of my favorite letters to do. And as you can see, there are huge differences here. We have this club serif at the top. This is a very different shape to the top of the T. We have a hairline start for the Y. The O, as I mentioned, you know, we have in Copperplate script, my O starts here, it finishes here, and it joins other letters quite easily. When you start at the top, connecting to another letter starts to become trickier. So there's lots of things which the geometry will help to sort out. And understanding what the history of these, the history behind these letters is really important. I know for a lot of people, they think, oh, but I just want to write. And I get that. You know, I love sitting here and writing. But understanding the history behind the letters is really important. Understanding what they're called is really important. And English roundhand is not Copperplate script. And Copperplate script differs dramatically from American scripts like engrossers and engraver scripts. And they all have their own little idiosyncrasies. Understanding how the nibs work differently, because all of the nibs work differently, will help you to choose which nib will work best for that particular iteration of the script that you've chosen to write. But by understanding the geometry, it will also help you to have an angular confinement system to house the letters, so you're not guessing where those curves are. So thank you very much for sitting through this with me. I hope you come back and you watch it again and you work along with it. Using the handout that I created, you will find some additional information in the handout on some of the Copperplate courses I have, some of my worksheets, which are much more extensive than this. And also things like the PA Scribe community where people can share work, and I look at the work in our office hours on a Wednesday from 6 to 8. There are tons of other things, tons of other PA Scribe products. So don't forget to follow me on Instagram at PA Scribe, and to follow Manuscript as well on Instagram. And have a look at the catalog that they have, which is obviously very extensive when it comes to writing tools and implements. And of course, some of the other products they carry, which are equally wonderful. Take your time with the with choosing your products, because I know it's very easy to sort of go through their catalog and go, I want this and this and this. And of course, you know, post the work, share it, tag me. I'd love to see what you're doing. If you run into some problems, by all means, you know, send me a message or leave a comment under here. I will come back and look at these, at the comments, and I will see how best I can assist you. Thank you very much.